Hi there. I'm Ian Glazer, Research Vice President and Agenda Manager for Gartner for Technical Professionals Identity and Privacy Strategies team. And I want to take the next few minutes to talk to you about the idea of big P privacy in the era of small things. But first, imagine you worked in a chemistry lab. It was a great lab. It's just a phenomenal place to work. It has all of the glassware, all of the equipment you would possibly need to create something truly wonderful, truly revolutionary. And it has all of the chemicals and all of the compounds you need to do your job. But there is a small catch. You see, all those chemicals, all those compounds, they're in unlabeled jars. Now, because the jars are unlabeled, you over time would have to figure out, oh, this one contains the acid and that one's really hazardous. I've got no idea about those two over there. And oh, yeah, that's the tequila from the holiday party. But you would figure them out, but it would take time. And it would also mean that every single jar contains a nasty surprise potentially, that when you combined two things, it could blow up in your face. It could harm you. It could kill you. So here's the question. Would you want to work in this lab? Would you want to operate in an environment where every single thing you pick up and touch has a potential nasty surprise? And if you did want to work in such a lab, how would you be productive? How would you keep yourself safe? How would you, avoid those nasty surprises lurking in those unlabeled jars? And furthermore, how would you keep your coworkers safe? How would they keep you safe? So big P privacy in the era of small things. Well, if there's a big P, there must be a little p. So why don't we start there? You see, little p privacy is something I think we're pretty familiar with. This is typified by the interactions between me and a service provider on the web. So when I'm working with a service provider, I have the option to set choices and preferences about what information I'd like to share, what information I'd like to disclose to other parties, how I'd like it used, and also things I don't want to have happen. Now, these choices become our privacy preferences. And those preferences are then consumed by the service provider, and they act as almost like authorization rules that govern the way the service provider actually uses the data that I share with them. And so this information that I give the service provider, they in turn return some value commensurate to what information I give them. And so this is the interaction that we have an individual with an individual service provider. And I'll say that from an industry-wide perspective, we're pretty good about respecting those privacy choices. We're good about first providing choice to individuals. We're pretty good about that, and they have pretty decent user experience components to them. And we're pretty good about respecting those choices. So yes, people have sent preferences, and now the service provider actually adheres to them. We're also getting better, and I would say pretty good, about providing notification when things change about how information is used. But that last item there, negotiation, we're not very good at, or renegotiation. You see, when things change, you don't necessarily have an option to push back against a service provider and say, I don't know if I agree with how you want to change and use this information. Because consider that the privacy preferences that you get to set, they're inside of what a service provider allows. So if you want to do something to say, oh, the way this kind of information that you have is being used, I want to set a different kind of preference, a preference that the provider doesn't allow for, well, that's outside of that sphere of privacy preferences. And frankly, if you do want to set something there, you're completely out of luck. There's just no way to do that. So if there's a major change to a service and you want to opt out of that change, well, that opt-out means really, frankly, you don't use the service anymore. And this brings us to the first question we should ask about privacy in the era of small things, which is to say, should the value that I get out of using a service be equal to the value the service provider gets out of me using that service? Or perhaps, should I receive more value than the service provider? maybe less value than the service provider. And the underlying question, of course, is, well, how the heck are we actually measuring value in this world? This leads us to the first of two asymmetries. This is the asymmetry of value. You see, in this era, I can compensate a service provider in two ways. I can give them old school currency, hard dollars, or I can give them new school currency, personal data. And it's becoming increasingly apparent that although the old school currency is nice, the new school currency is what people are really valuing, what people are really trying to get more of. And it's also becoming apparent, I think, that the service providers are getting more value out than the individual is. And this asymmetry of value typifies what's happening in the small p privacy world, where I'm interacting with a single service provider. So then, what is big P privacy? Consider that no data set is an island, that service providers are always going to look to enrich and enhance information that I provide to deliver me more value. And often they're going to do this through exchanging information with other service providers. This is how they deliver more to me. They give me more service. And this is, quite frankly, how they turn new school currency into old school currency. So the world of big P privacy is when service providers interact with one another. And there's a real question as an individual, how are my privacy preferences being respected amongst these interactions of service providers? This brings us to the second asymmetry, the asymmetry of relationship. So imagine that you've got a service provider with whom you work. You love them. You love every aspect of their service. You've set your privacy preferences and you're very comfortable with them. And you've been putting information into the service provider and getting value back. The question is, however, in order to deliver all that awesome value, the service provider is exchanging some of that information with another service provider. They're enhancing it with another service provider's service. Question is, how do I know my privacy preferences are being respected by that second provider? So in general, how do I know that my preferences that I express are being fully acknowledged and adhered to throughout all of the service providers out there? And frankly, how do I even know that those service providers exist? This is a truly dark art. Understanding the providers, your providers, and the providers they work with, that's a dark art. Well, to be fair, it's not really a dark art for two reasons. You see, you can, over time, learn a dark art. You can figure out all the arcane workings of it, and you can master it. But in this day and age, discovering a service provider's provider, well, that's basically impossible. It's impossible for two reasons, actually. The first is, whatever happens behind the API stays behind the API. You see, all this enrichment and enhancement of information between service providers, that goes on way beyond the view of what I as an individual can see. It's happening behind the API. The second reason why it's impossible to know your provider's provider is that they may not know themselves. Imagine this. You've got a service provider, you love them, and they enrich, enhance, exchange data with two other service providers, who in turn have two other service providers, who in turn have two more, and then they tell two friends, and then they tell two friends. And soon enough, your information has now pervaded all the nooks and crannies of this English muffin we call the world. So in this complex network of enhancement, enrichment, exchange of data, it's really unrealistic to think that your service provider knows anything about the service provider way down here. So knowing your provider's provider, it's a dark art. Well, there's actually a second reason why it's not really a dark art. You see, when you're practicing the dark arts, you know with which nefarious power you're dealing. You call the devil by name, and she gives you the ability to play guitar better than anybody else. You know the devil you're working with. You see, in this era, in the era of small things, you're really putting blind trust in a service provider. You don't know the name. You don't know them. And there's no way to verify that your privacy preferences are being respected all the way through the exchange of information. This is the world of big P privacy. So a little summary. In little p privacy, it's my interactions with the service provider, and the asymmetry we observe there is the asymmetry of value. And in the world of big P privacy, it's not just my interaction with a service provider, it's then the follow-on interactions with all of their service providers. And the asymmetry we observe here is the asymmetry of relationship. Let me throw some numbers at you. 7. See, 7 is the number of data points I need to establish uniqueness in the physical world. You see, it takes about 7 pieces of data from a fingerprint, you look at the whorls and the ridges and whatnot, to determine that this finger is different than that finger. So that's 7 pieces of information. Well, how many data points does it take to establish uniqueness in the digital world? Take a guess. The answer's 4. You see, specifically 4 latitude, longitude, and timestamp readings. That's all I need in order to determine that this thing is different from that thing that's living in the small thing world we live in. You see, this comes out of research called Unique in the Crowd. And researchers looked at just this very problem. How do we determine uniqueness in the digital world? And it works like this. They started with an anonymized data set from a mobile phone carrier. And they realized that if they just had 4 latitude, longitude, and timestamp readings, that they could uniquely identify devices 95% of the time. So with 4 readings of data, they could identify uniqueness. So ask yourself, how many small things do you have on your person right now? Your phone, your iPad, your Fitbit, any number of these small devices. How many of them use location data? For those that don't, how many of them interact with something that do use location data? How do you know? How would you know that? How would you verify that? You see, in this era of small things, we are surrounded by a cloud of silicon. And it's not just our phones, it's all of these other small things that pervade our world, that surround us. Now, we're good at setting our privacy preferences with any one of these things and establishing preferences amongst them. This is small p privacy, and I think we're okay about that. But we also have to consider the interactions amongst all of these things. And certainly there's enough interaction here to provide more than those 4 data points needed to uniquely identify us. So even if I think these devices are using some form of anonymous information, their interactions will be able to uniquely re-identify me. And this is the world of big P privacy. Let me throw one more number out at you. 0. You see, 0 is the number of service providers with whom you need to have a relationship in order for them to have data about you. This is what I mean. This is a picture from a company called Euclid. Euclid does really neat retail analysis capabilities. They can tell a retailer, this is how many people walk in front of your store at this time of day. They can determine, oh, you know, your outlet stores a couple miles away, they're actually stealing business from your flagship store downtown. How do they do this? Well, you see, they grab the MAC address of every device looking for Wi-Fi that walks by the store or walks in the store. This is how it works. You see, this is Phil's Coffee. This is, in fact, the Phil's location in the Mission in San Francisco. And Phil's uses Euclid. So you're walking down the street, and you walk by Phil's. Now, you have no interest in going into Phil's Coffee because you're a Blue Bottle person, so you're thinking, nope, I don't have a relationship with Phil's. I don't expect to get any value out of this interaction because there's going to be no interaction. But Phil's has deployed Euclid. So it scarfs up your MAC address, it hashes it, and then it starts to use that in the analytics that Euclid provides. So now, even though you have no relationship with this retailer, they have a little bit of information about you. And so they're going to get a little bit of value out of you, but you don't have a relationship with them. So you may be saying, I don't know if I like that necessarily. How would I opt out? Well, first, you'd have to know that Euclid was being used. And Phil conveniently provides a sticker that tells you, hey, Euclid's being used. And then you would go to the Euclid website and you'd put in your MAC address of all the small things around you. Well, that may not be a super convenient or really way you'd want to handle this. So maybe it would be better to shut off Wi-Fi for all of your devices every time you leave the house. Quite frankly, that's not very convenient either. So other options for opting out would include some sort of lead line burqa number that would block all the radio frequency signals, or maybe just moving to the Google opt-out village. The long and the short of it is, opting out in the physical world is not easy. And what the asymmetry of relationship tells us is, you've got far more relationships than you know. In fact, you have far more relationships than you can ever know. So we don't just think about the small things that orbit us in this cloud of silicon. We have to think about the service providers that represent those small things, that construct them, that provide the service to them. And to that, we have to add all the other service providers that service those first set of service providers. This is the world of big P privacy. And I'll tell you, we can't handle this. We don't know how to handle this. And this is not a hypothetical. This is the world here and now. And tackling operating in the big P privacy world affects both individuals and companies. We're all trying to figure out, how the heck do we operate in this world? Let's return to the chemistry lab. Over time, over a lot of effort, and quite frankly, the horrific deaths of your coworkers, you would figure out what's in the jars. Through institutional knowledge and tribal knowledge, you would start to build up this, oh, I know that's the acid. I know that one is caustic. That one's flammable. And the thing about it is, if we were to operate safely in this lab, we'd have to create some operating procedures that would look like this. First off, treat every jar the same way, and assume it contains the most hazardous, most horrible thing ever. So every jar we treat the same way, and we make the assumption that what we are handling is of the utmost danger to the individual and to our peers. It's the only way to be sure. Now, this is awfully cautious, and frankly, the auditing and other compliance mechanisms we'd have to operate safely would be pretty onerous. And that means that, working in this lab is going to be pretty time consuming and awfully inefficient. And that means the lab is really going to be very expensive to manage, to work in, to run. But you see, the story gets a little messier. There's a lab down the hall that hears, hey, I hear you guys are working on a really cool compound. If we could get a sample of that, I think we can add it to what we're working on and make something truly magical. We'll even pay you for it. You say, okay, that sounds good. So you put a sample in a jar, you ship it down the hall. But of course, you don't label the jar. And the other lab, they don't exactly know what's in the jar. So you tell me, how is this going to end well? Well, that chemistry lab, that's your business. The jars, that's the information that customers have shared with you. Now, how you handle those jars, that's how you respect their privacy preferences. It's also how you obey local law and customs. And this is the world of small p privacy. Now, that lab down the hall, that's another service provider. And so, without knowing what's in the jar or how it should be handled, which is to say, not knowing the information provided to them, the nature of that information, and not knowing the associated privacy preferences, I believe there is no way those other service providers can respect the customer's privacy. There's just no chance for it. And this is the world of big P privacy. So the question is, what can we do about this? How do we operate in such a world? How do we operate in a world that has both little p and big P privacy requirements? How do we begin to address the asymmetries of value and relationship? Well, there's three things that I think can be done. The first is privacy preferences must flow with the data, which is to say, when I establish my preferences with a service provider with whom I've got a direct relationship that I know about, that those preferences have to travel throughout all the interactions that service provider has with other providers. Now, one of the things that I believe is a requirement to do this is durable metadata. We need metadata that every party can inspect that describes what it is, the information is, so describes what's in the jar, and describes some of the obligations or requirements and preferences regarding that information. Now, there are a variety of ways of tackling this problem. Creative Commons has done some interesting things called CC-REL, which is a way of attributing creation rights to pieces of media. And I've worked on something called relationship context metadata, which does a similar thing but for more enterprise style data. Long and the short of it is this durable metadata helps us get to the third state, which is essentially labeling the jars. We cannot rely on unlabeled jars and horrific accidents to figure out what it is we're handling. We need to actually know what we're handling. And to do that, we need to label the jars. So if we know what we're handling and we know how it should be handled, then our labs, our businesses, become more cost effective and more efficient. And that means more money. It also gives us a way of protecting our partners. We can tell them what they're about to handle. That likely means more money too. It also means at its root, we are respecting our customers. We're respecting their wishes, their preferences. And if that's the case, then that's going to yield more interaction, which means more new school currency, more personal information that's being shared and disclosed. And we turn that into old school currency. So I believe we need to do three things. Privacy preferences have to flow with the data. We need durable, inspectable metadata that tells us what we're handling. And in essence, we need to label the jars. This is the way we handle big P privacy in the era of small things. And I want to thank my colleagues, both current and past, who have helped me with this research, as well as some of the other individuals you see here. And I look forward to hearing your comments. Take care, everyone.